Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan, the podcast where we pursue big questions. My goal today is to listen and learn just a little bit more. As we head into our conversation, let me invite you to chase life's biggest questions with me, one episode at a time. Dr. Colin McAllister, wonderful to have you on today. Could you tell us a little bit, how did you get into your career, and how did you get interested in this question of medieval apocalyptic tradition in general? Or, well, specifically for like some of the, I know that you have a book that's coming out that you edited.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks for having me, PJ. Great to be here. So I'm a classical guitarist and a conductor by training. All of my degrees, undergraduate and graduate degrees, are related to that. So I took an interest. My brother. So I guess the way I really got into this was through language. So my younger brother, was a classics major at university. And he said, "Oh, this is really cool. I'm learning Latin. I'm studying all this Roman stuff, and you might be interested in it." And I said, "Oh, that does sound cool." But I was in graduate school at the time. I was really busy. And so when I finished graduate school, I went and took a 3-semester Latin sequence at a local community college where I was living in San Diego. It was like, okay, I've been in graduate school for music. Now that I'm out, I'm going to just do something a little bit different. So I got into Latin, and I was, trying to read the usual kinds of authors, I guess, Caesar and Cicero and so forth. And then I became interested in some of the patristic authors, the church fathers, and especially an author called Lactantius, who was he was writing during the time of the persecution of Diocletian, and he was trying to promote Christianity to the elite Roman audiences. But one of the complaints of the elite Roman audiences, as you know, is that they thought that the scriptures were written in a very simplistic kind of language, that, this wasn't for the elite. And so Lactantius wrote purposefully in this elevated Latin style. He was even called the Christian Cicero during the Renaissance period by some of these authors who were looking back to Rome. So I got interested in Lactantius, and I was trying to read a little bit of him. And I met a colleague out here in Colorado, a woman who at the time taught Greek and Latin at UCCS, a wonderful woman called Mary France. And she said, "Oh, this is great. You're interested in this. You might like to meet a guy I know who does all of this early medieval Latin apocalyptic stuff." And I said, "Yes, I would like to meet him." So he lives not too far from me up in Denver. His name is Frank Gummerlock, and he's probably done more translations than anyone of early medieval commentaries on the book of Revelation from Latin into English. So he was very excited. He said, "Oh my gosh, this is great that there's someone else that's interested in this. I'll send you some stuff if you want." So he and I started collaborating a little bit. And that's really kind of how I got into it, was through learning about these Latin commentaries on the book of Revelation. And then from that, I kind of broadened my view into things apocalyptic in general, and met some other great folks along the way who were just really encouraging. Bernard McGinn, John Collins, Lorenzo Di Tommaso, with whom I think you had been in touch.
Yeah.
And all of these folks were just really encouraging. And so, it just kind of blossomed from there.
Awesome. And so as we look at this question of like the medieval apocalyptic tradition, what for you has stood out as probably the most important feature of it? Something that just really, what drives your interest in it?
Well, maybe it's good to back up and just talk a little bit about the kind of origins of apocalypticism in general.
Sure.
And how it led to that. So, apocalypticism, it's a way of thinking about the world, a way of thinking about space and time and human existence and the end of the world. And from that worldview, if you are a person who has that worldview, then you might produce an apocalyptic piece of literature or work of art or piece of music or what have you. And so this idea of apocalypticism really came out of Second Temple Judaism. So, in the period of the 3rd to 2nd centuries BCE in Judea, and at this time, the first pieces of apocalyptic literature were produced. And these are things like the book of First Enoch, the book of Daniel, right? The War Scroll from the Qumran literature. And then, of course, slightly later examples that are better known, things like the book of Daniel from the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And then, of course, the godfather of apocalyptic literature, the Revelation of John, the Apocalypse of John, the last book in the New Testament. And so these are the earliest examples of apocalyptic literature. And out of these really emanate all these characteristics that we would associate with apocalypticism or apocalyptica writ large, from that time into the medieval period and, even into today. So, the medieval period, what was really interesting at that time, and, we might even think about kind of this long medieval millennium from maybe the fall of Rome in the West to the start of the Protestant Reformation, if we put these two kind of long markers on it. And there's just so much interesting stuff that's happening because, well, of course, on one hand, the book of Revelation was continuing to be interpreted by Christian exegetes all during this period for every generation. And it still happens now, right?
Oh, yeah.
If you go down to Barnes and Noble and go to the Christian section, you'll find a book on, that some contemporary author is saying, well, it turns out that the book of Revelation is actually saying that the number 666 is Joe Biden or Ukraine, whatever, right? So,
oh, yeah.
The same thing is true during the medieval period, and that's really fascinating. I'm interested in this commentary tradition because, as I say, it's kind of like a Google search engine for figuring out what people were concerned with at the time. So is the book of Revelation, the turmoil, the destruction that's in there, is that referring to heretics within the church? Is it referring to the Muslim incursion into Europe? Is it referring to the rise of the Protestant Reformation? Right. So you can read these commentaries and kind of track what folks' concerns were. So on the one hand, you've got that. On the other hand, you've got this Antichrist tradition, which is really interesting. And is Antichrist a monster? Is it a person? Who is the Antichrist? There's lots of finger pointing that goes on in the medieval period. You have a lot of millenarian sects that arise, groups of dispossessed folks who have some kind of charismatic leader that comes in who they think is the Messiah, and they go on some kind of mission or quest that usually ends in a catastrophic failure. And then you have also in the medieval period, there are a number of tropes, of little ideas that developed earlier. Things like, well, I mentioned Antichrist, but also the end time peoples of Gog and Magog, or the legend of the last Roman emperor. And you have these little things that are recycled in all kinds of different ways across different cultures, languages, and regions in the whole larger European world. And then apocalypticism, the idea about it even influences some of the early European explorers who were coming over to the New World. So I think that's what's the most interesting about this medieval period, is just that it's vast. There's so many things in there that you can take a look at. And I think they're fascinating.
And thank you. And I think you answered it really well. For our listeners, it's actually funny. I met my wife in Greek class, but it's been 10 years. So if I say anything in Greek, just bear with me, because I'm sure it's absolutely horrendous. But like the word for apocalypse is the word for revelation. That's where right? And so that idea of to reveal, but it's come to mean this idea of, and correct me if I'm wrong, of revealing the end times, the end of the world. And so, and that's what kind of you're hinting at, right? Like, not hinting at, you were saying clearly that people were talking about the end of their world, and for some people it was the Protestant Reformation, for some people it was the incursion of the Muslims, or it was heretics in the church. It's like this is the end of the world, and it's really interesting to see what, like you said, like you get this reflection of cultural fears in medieval commentaries, in art. Um, I definitely think of the works of, is it Bosque, the painter?
Oh, Hieronymus Bosch,
Yeah, Bosch. Yes,
yeah,
yeah. Um,
absolutely.
so that I am tracking with you. What's interesting to me, you mentioned the Second Temple Judaism, and people, if they're familiar with theology, know about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, but a lot of people don't know about is it the Essenes? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's the Qumran,
Yeah,
the folks that lived in the caves at Qumran. Yeah,
yes, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? I'm making sure that I'm
that's right.
tracking with you. Okay, so
That's right.
when we talk about the SC, what's interesting to me is that in a lot of these cases, and you mentioned it with kind of like referencing the Essenes or Essenes or however you say that, and then with the millenarians, that it's often this becomes this radical and force for change that often many times can fail, but it is kind of this radical and transcendent community, right? It's this very stark way of looking at the world. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And it's also, well, to go back to this idea of revelation. So
Yeah.
uh, apocalyptic literature is usually there are two kinds of aspects that are revealed. It's either the revelation of like divine mysteries, so a
Ah.
tour of heaven or a tour of the netherworld, right? There are apocalyptic literature that engages with that aspect. But then there's also this idea of the historical aspect of apocalyptic literature. Is it talking about things that are going to happen before the end of the world or before the Messiah comes back, and God kind of makes this eruption into the landscape of human history to change things forcefully. So early apocalyptic literature can kind of be based more or less in one of those two categories. But it's also, to your point, produced in circumstances of persecution or perceived persecution of some kind, right? So
The important
certainly,
distinction. Yes.
yeah. So Second Temple Judaism, of course, Judea is being ruled by different peoples. There's a big war with the Seleucid Empire. There's a war with the Roman Empire, and this is the time that all of these classic apocalypses were produced. But in today's modern age, you might have a group that, for whatever reason, feels that it's being persecuted by morality of society. Society's morals have gone wrong. We are a group that is standing true against this, and that could cause, this kind of apocalyptic thinking. Or more dire examples, you look at one of the things that when I teach my class on apocalypticism, we always talk about, I usually have a couple lectures called Apocalypse Gone Wrong. And this is the idea of groups like the People's Temple or the Branch Davidians, who felt that they were the elect, the persecuted in this end times conflagration. And of course, as we know, those situations went really badly. So yeah, there's certainly an aspect of persecution, and yeah, I guess you might say a stark view of the world, a very dualistic view of the world is important, right? Apocalypticism has within it this idea of a strong dualism between, what is good, what is evil, what is the elect, the chosen group, who is the other. Talk about the other a lot in the idea of medieval apocalypticism. If you don't have an other, whatever that is, a person, a group, an idea, that's somehow oppressing you or opposing your viewpoints as the elect, then the apocalyptic construct doesn't really work out so well.
Yeah, even as you're talking about that, um, it's funny because my granddaddy, who's been passed for a couple decades now, but like uh even personally, like every time I saw him, like, he would talk to me a little bit, but he's like, the trumpet's going to sound one of these days, and it's like, and it's shown up in different strands. Like, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is primarily Abrahamic, right? In fact, specifically Judaism and Christianity.
And Islam too has apocalyptic aspects in it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Did you
Yeah.
do some work
All
in
the
that as well?
Abrahamic faith. I edited the Cambridge Companion to Apocalyptic Literatures, and there is an article by a fabulous colleague of mine called a fellow called David Cook, who deals a lot with that. And so I don't have that language at all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But he does. And and he works with it quite a bit. So there is, so all the Abrahamic religions are, they're teleological in the idea that there's a start to history and there's an end to history. And so, if you have a circular history where things are constantly being rebirthed, there's no idea truly of apocalypticism can't hold because there can't be a finite, definitive end.
Yeah, and it seems like, to take it from almost a literary point of view, that there's a real it's kind of like what happens in the third act, right? Like that's what a lot of this is concerned with. And are we in the third act? And so if you're going to give one of these visions, it's always either about the third act and most of the time we are in the third act, at least in the not in the. And I do want to ask you about the revelations of like the netherworlds and heaven, but as far as like the end of the world, the end times, that seems to be that kind of obsession with that end. Um, and that's something I hadn't thought about. Can you talk a little bit about the revelation of heaven? And when you said netherworld, is that reference to hell? Is that a reference to like purgatory? Would this count like Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy?
Well, I think that, some of these earlier medieval revelations like this, are sort of precursors, absolutely, to something like Dante's Comedy, right? Where, it is a tour of things that are happening in heaven, visions that are happening in heaven, rewards that wait in heaven, and then a tour of how the sinners are suffering in hell. There's something called the Visio Sancti Pauli, the vision of Paul from the early medieval period that really specifically deals with that. And if you were to read that, and you had also read Dante's Inferno, you could say, see some similarities between those kinds of things, pointing out the sufferings of sinners, and a lot of, to your earlier point about feeling like the third act is about to happen. That's also something about apocalyptic thinking that it's going to happen fairly soon, right? It doesn't really, if I were to preach an apocalyptic sermon here in my house to my kids about how, these things, the world is going to end 10 million years from now, and that, they're probably going to say, meh, well, we'll just leave. We won't eat our vegetables after all. You can't frighten us to make us eat those vegetables, right? But if I say, hey, you need to eat those vegetables because the end of the world is going to happen very soon, the imminence of it, that's important. So apocalyptic thought is concerned with the future, what's going to happen in the third act, as you say, but that's all really designed to reflect upon the present. Apocalyptic literature is exhortatory in the sense that it's trying to encourage a group of folks to continue the course, to, stray from the evil ways, to eat those vegetables on your plate before you get dessert, right? One of my students actually said that, you mentioned your grandfather. One of my students, I was doing a survey the first day of class, and I said, what does apocalypse mean to you? And most of them are going with kind of more contemporary rebootings of the definition about, it's the aliens are going to come, or it's the zombies, or an asteroid's going to strike the earth, or the climate is going to go into the tank or whatever. But one girl said that when she was little, her grandmother did tell her that if she didn't clean her plate or eat her vegetables, that fire and brimstone was waiting on the other side. So I said that's a creative use of the idea of apocalypse, related to proper diet. Maybe I should have tried that when my kids were younger.
Fire and brimstone because you didn't eat your vegetables.
There you go. Yeah, got to eat those vegetables.
You got to have the vitamin K. It's really, really important.
Yeah, balanced diet to meet the end time.
And so, I think part of what it sounds like it's very important to create, and this has come up in, like you said, Apocalypse Gone Wrong, with the Branch Davidians, and I missed the name. Was that Jim Jones? Was the other one? Is that
People's Temple. Yeah,
People's Temple.
Forced suicide. Heaven's Gate. Also, you might remember that group out of San Diego who, they also committed mass suicide.
Yeah, and there's a sense of, it's to create a sense of urgency for radical action. Is that like, at least in those cases? But I think about the and maybe you can, when you talk about the art associated with it. I'm familiar with, like, in Luther's time, they would have like not that they called them judgment shows, I think, where they would they would unfurl posters. Well, posters. Wow. They're cloth. What are they called? Like, they had like
a tapestry or a banner.
Yeah, tapestry.
Or something.
Yes, they had tapestries. Okay. I don't know. I was like cloth posters.
I like poster. Poster's good.
There you go. But they would go from town to town asking, like, people to give money to the church, and they would act out scenes of damnation, right? And the idea is to create a sense of urgency. That's really, and so I think, even as I mentioned the tapestries there, I'm really curious, what have you taken from your background in music? And you referenced that there is music that's apocalyptic. How have you found it? Have you found any connections there? And what kind of connections?
Fine. Yes, actually. So, for a while, this apocalyptic research was sort of on the side for me. I mean, I had my music thing, and then I had that, and they sort of were in kind of separate worlds. And then, my interest, kind of the interest in everything I do is related to the creation of artistic work. That's I'm at my core, that's what I am. I'm a creator. I like to perform new works. I like to commission composers to create new works. I like to, write music myself. And so there was always this urge within me to figure out, like, okay, what are you doing with this? You're not just going to sit and translate as 8th century Latin commentary and that's going to be the end of it. I did do that, but try to fold this back in. So actually, there's a book coming out next year published by Brill in their Word and Music series that's called Dies Irae, Dies Illa, Music in the Apocalyptic Mode. And it's a co-edited volume by Lorenzo Di Tommaso and myself. And we got, I think it's maybe 18 authors to write on different aspects of what we thought was music in an apocalyptic mode. Everything from medieval settings of the Dies Irae, which is that 13th century hymn whose theme, the musical theme, has been quoted in everything from Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique to the score by Wendy Carlos for the movie The Shining, the Kubrick movie The Shining. If you watch the opening scene, you'll hear that, bum, 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 dun, 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 and that's the melody to the Dies Irae. So our volume covers everything from that through medieval settings of texts from the Sibylline oracles to end time elements in the music of Bach and Telemann, to Richard Wagner, to Arnold Schoenberg. I wrote an article in there about early music of Arnold Schoenberg, to Olivier Messiaen, his piece, The Quartet for the End of Time, all through African American spirituals and blues, whose lyrics were heavily driven by, end time thinking, by the promise of a better world, the promise of the New Jerusalem that would supplant evil society of the present, through Rastafarianism and the music of Bob Marley, and all the way to like contemporary death metal. So we've got
that would make sense. Death metal,
whole range of articles that are trying to engage with different aspects of music in an apocalyptic mode, and so, it's kind of in two broad categories. The easiest one to engage with, I think, is the idea of lyrical settings, right? If you have a contemporary Christian metal band, like there was one in the 80s called Saint, for instance. I didn't know about them, but I found out about it because of this article that was written by a colleague. They had a whole record, this band, and it's a heavy metal band, but the record is really about the book of Revelation. So they're either directly setting texts from Revelation or paraphrasing texts from Revelation about things that happen and putting in the context of a heavy metal song. So lyrical content is one thing. But when Lorenzo and I first talked about this volume, I was like, what about music? Because as a musician, the lyrics, that's different. That's not the music for me. I'm like, well, what about music? So some of the articles, and especially mine, are trying to deal with this idea of, okay, what could be construed as apocalypticism in instrumental music itself? So that whole, so it's really great that this thinking finally led to this project, and it should be coming out early next year. And I'm really excited about that, because that will finally prove to my musical colleagues that, I haven't just gone off the deep end the last few years in doing this apocalyptic stuff, as one of my colleagues referred to it. He says, well, I don't know about that apocalyptic stuff that you're doing. Well, we'll bring it full circle here eventually.
Yeah.
Luckily, it's great that I do have a university who's very supportive of different research aims, really, even though I'm in the Department of Visual and Performing Arts and my, title is Professor of Music, they allow me to do all these other things. And it's really been very nourishing in that way. I feel like maybe if I had been at a university where they had a big department of religious studies and a big department of I don't know, theology or something, that maybe folks would have thought, well, you're kind of stepping in our turf here, back off a little bit. But I didn't encounter any of that. So I guess that's the, blessing really of being at a little bit smaller university that's encouraging of humanities in a broad way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's a big deal for me. Like, people often ask, like, are you a philosophy podcast? And I have a lot of philosophy professors on this show, but for me, it's very important that as we're pursuing big questions, that we take an interdisciplinary approach, right? Like, there's a lot you can learn. I'm very leery of pure armchair theorizing. I do a lot of that, but I love to have, when we talk about, like, what does art mean for the human being? One episode in particular sticks out to me. I had a master sculptor and stone carver come on, and it's so, one of the things that's easy to miss when you're not engaged in like performing arts and you're just thinking about art is that how much work it is. She was like, this is like, it's physically exhausting. Like I'm carving stone, like when you look at pictures of her, she's got like a mask on, like a full, like, she looks like she's about to like go into the trenches, and she's just like, what she's carving is just like stone dust everywhere. Right. And so, that idea, like that's really awesome. Your university allows you to be interdisciplinary like that. And I think it sometimes takes a while for it to come to fruition. But even as you're talking, like it produces these new, I wouldn't say new fields of study, but like something special, right? Something that you wouldn't get if you just stayed in your lane, so to speak. That's really awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that and one of the things I tell, the class that I teach on apocalypticism is through our humanities program. It's under the umbrella of humanities. And yeah, that's what I tell the students is that, this class is going to give you a space, a temporal and an intellectual space to think about a really important issue, right? What's going to happen after you die, or what's going to happen at the end of history or the end of the world. And so by having this broad-based approach, by looking at philosophy, by looking at different religious aspects, by looking at cultural aspects, artistic aspects, you do get the most well-informed view. So yeah, I'm a huge believer in the cooperation of all these fields in the humanities. It certainly makes my life more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of value in something that's just interesting. You tend to get better work if things are interesting. It's interesting. I had not this is just a random connection, but it leads into the question I'd love to get to eventually. But the Dies Irae, I saw a video essay on that where someone went through and traced how that is almost always used. Even we come to recognize it, and often it works subconsciously because it's a cultural motif for death. So even as you mentioned, it shows up in The Shining. I think they showed it shows up in the Avengers, or in one of the Marvel movies, but not as a main theme. It's just when someone's about to die or they're close to death, they'll put those notes in there, and it tells the audience, it's like, no, this is serious, And what's interesting to me about what you've been talking about is, and this is, with my work in philosophical hermeneutics.
This is punch.
No worries. I love having a guest on the show. Is how much human culture, you can see the things that stay the same, the things that change, and the way that the same thing can go through different, it's recognizable, but it's going through different permutations, right? Dies Irae in The Shining is very different from, I believe there's a Mozart version of it, right?
Probably it was part of the Requiem Mass.
Yes. Yeah.
The church. So every setting of the Requiem Mass,
yes.
By Mozart and others would have, entertained that theme.
And so it's fascinating to me to see that. Can you talk a little bit more about your project, and because it's fascinating to me, and that's a world I'm not familiar with. How would you communicate apocalypticism through music? And I know that's a sneak peek into your upcoming book, but that sounds fascinating to me because immediately in my mind there's just a blank wall. I'm like, I have no idea.
Right. Well, so one, just kind of, if we look at a sort of broader category, for me, the idea of the ending and transfiguration of the tonal system in music is a possible idea. So I don't know how much your viewers entertain the ideas of music and tonality, but basically, if I were to just boil it down, tonal music, the tonal system, is a way of organizing pitches, chords, and melody that evolved over a period of about 300 years, from the late Renaissance up into the late 19th century. And essentially the idea is, I don't have my guitar with me, I'd play for you, but you have a home base, and then you have other stuff that goes on around it. And you always come back to that home base, right? So if we listen to any song that's composed tonally, which is most of the music we listen to, there's always this home base. So the ear is hearing other dissonant sounds that are happening around it, but you always want to come back to home base, right? And that's the tonal system.
That's where you see those skits with musical comedians where they do the 4-chord song and they go from pop song to pop song and they're not changing anything except what they're singing, right? It's that idea. It's they use the same 4 chords. It always comes back to that beginning one.
Well, that's true. So yeah, you do have, most popular music is composed using a fairly limited number of of chords and pitches. But that's like, you know, if you were to go and play the happy birthday song for somebody and you ended with happy birthday to, and then you don't end it, that's
Right.
because it's not ending on the tonic chord. It's like, okay, thank goodness. Played that last chord. We've come to rest.
Yes.
So that very simply is a definition of tonality. And what happened in general over the course of this period of time is that the system of tonality became more and more complex. Composers were taking us on a journey farther away from the tonal center and taking increasingly longer and longer periods of time to get back to it. A famous example is Richard Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde, where at the very beginning of the opera in the prelude, there's a couple of chords that are played, and one of them is what we call a dominant 7 chord. So it's a dissonant chord that wants to resolve back to tonic. But Wagner doesn't do that. In fact, he never resolves that chord until the very end of the opera, which is 4 hours later, almost 4 hours later, right? So because it never resolves properly, the music constantly stays in motion. And as a result, it has this constant inner tension to it, which of course Wagner is mapping the music to the psychological tension, the sexual tension of the opera itself. Tristan und Isolde is basically a kind of Romeo and Juliet story for folks who don't know that. And so at the very end of the opera, Tristan dies, and Isolde is so heartbroken that she sings herself to death in this famous aria called the Liebestod. So she collapses lifeless on the body of Tristan. And then after that happens, Wagner finally resolves all of the chords into this beautiful tonic that lasts, for 30 seconds or something, and is repeated by all the instruments. And it's this very powerful moment that's kind of like, okay, well, Tristan and Isolde could never consummate their love except in death. That was the only way they could be together. And so that big final cadence, this final resolution to the tonic, happens at the end of this opera. So that was in the 1850s. And after that, composers who, engaged with Wagner, which almost all of them did in the 19th century, were like, okay, what are we going to do now? He's taken this tonal system so far afield. How, if we are, and especially that 19th century aesthetic of artists feeling like that to create art was to create something new.
Right.
It's not this postmodern idea that you just recycle stuff that had come before. No, it's the idea of modernism that you're creating, that art is steadily evolving, this kind of thing. And so a lot of these later 19th century composers were really perplexed with this idea of what to do with it. And Arnold Schoenberg in particular, who's a Viennese composer who came of age in the last decade of the 19th century, really started to feel that, well, maybe the way forward is to abandon tonality. It's a big, that's a big project. That's this system that kind of held music in place for 300 years. And so he does, and my article in the book talks about specific pieces between this period from 1899 till like 1909, this 10-year period, where he's really feeling his way forward. For me, the music is very powerful. He's writing very intuitively. He's really grasping for something new. And finally, that's what he does end up doing, is he ends up writing pieces that no longer have a tonal center. And one in particular that I focus on is the last movement of his second string quartet, which sets this really sort of apocalyptic poetry of Stefan George, who was a really interesting poet from that period. And so to me, a case could be made for thinking of apocalypse as the idea of this system just kind of implodes upon itself. And then how is it transfigured and what happens on the other side of that?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that made sense. That's one idea, kind of just in very general terms, of how could you talk about the idea of apocalypse in instrumental music? The other one might be the idea of the ending of metrical time in music. So again, most music that we listen to has a beat that's somewhat discernible, right? And it's organized. Most music is organized in time because music exists in time. It's organized in time in a way that has recurring cycles of beats or recurring metrical patterns. So that if you're listening to a Mozart symphony, for instance, you can kind of snap your fingers to it or tap your head because you're hearing this pattern of stresses and accents within the music as it goes along. Certainly in techno music at a club, you have this bass that's pounding like this, and there's no chance at all that you're going to get lost from the music, right? Your whole purpose is to hear that pulse, and that's true of most tonal music. And in 1941, there was a composer who was taken as a prisoner of war, a French composer called Olivier Messiaen, and he was imprisoned by the Germans. And but he was allowed. He was already at that time a well-known composer, and so his German guards in the camp allowed him to continue to write music, and they even did a performance. And so he wrote this piece. He said he was inspired because of malnourishment and poor living conditions and maybe sleep deprivation. He said he had visions of this angel from chapter 10 of the book of Revelation. And so he wrote this piece, a quartet for piano, clarinet, cello, and violin called Quartet for the End of Time. And he was talking about how in this passage of Revelation, the angel says, well, time will be no more. And so in this piece, he uses some compositional devices to kind of take us away from feeling where the pulse is. And so that's another example of, okay, tonality coming to an end in music, being reborn in a way, metrical time coming to an end and being reborn, and how does that play out in later music of the 20th and 21st centuries composed in that vein. So those are two kind of bigger areas of how I think about apocalypticism in play in instrumental music. And then I guess a third area, I mentioned earlier that I'm interested in creation of new art. That's really my whole bag. So I have commissioned some pieces to be written for me where I ask composers specifically to engage with the idea of apocalypse in these pieces and how might that play out. So that's a kind of more recent project for me. And in fact, in this volume, this Dies Irae volume that I mentioned to you, we have essays by 3 composers on their own pieces, short essays. These are pieces composed in the last 5 years saying, okay, how did the idea of engagement with apocalypse inform your compositional process? So I'm really interested in that too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so just to make sure I'm tracking with you, I don't know a lot of music theory, but I think I know enough when you're talking about the chords and I think everyone understood from the Happy Birthday, like that's a classic. Like you go up, you play the scale, and then you don't hit the last note, and everyone in the room is like, no, hit, please,
right? Yeah, if you leave it there, people are going to be like, your skin is itching.
Yes. Yeah. And then even with the metrical time, people get frustrated if they don't have something to tap their foot to, right? And what's interesting is, so if I'm tracking with you, it seems like the dissolution of structure, the falling apart of structure, is in some ways what you're perceiving as the apocalypse in instrumental music. The kind of and I think that makes sense even from in philosophy, they'll talk about death being the end of rationality, right? Like that's we can't perceive past death because we don't have we don't have rationality anymore, and it's almost it. And I'm spitballing here, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. But this idea that like we are losing structure, we are losing comprehension, and it's invoking death in some way. It's invoking an end. Is that kind of what you're pointing at, or am I missing the point entirely?
No, I think you are getting to it. And I mean, I'm not arguing that all music that's not tonal would be apocalyptic. I'm arguing really for these specific moments, because there's more. In my article about Schoenberg, I talk about this, the expressionist milieu into which he's dealing, and his idea of the musical idea and the idea of genius. There's a lot of other stuff in there. But I'm arguing for this abandonment of structure at a specific historical point in musical evolution. I wouldn't say, but then of course we say, well, what's the aftermath of that? This piece of Schoenberg's 1908 second string quartet had over 100 years now of music that's being composed in all kinds of ways. So it definitely set the course, I think, of music history on a different direction. And that's, I guess, why I would say that at that specific moment, we could maybe make an argument for that there was an apocalyptic event that happened at that time. But to your point more largely about loss of structure, I do think that apocalyptic thinking a lot of times is in a reflection of an individual or a group feeling that they are lost in the structure of history.
Yeah.
Frank Kermode in a book in the 1950s said that we are born into the middle of things in medias res. So that we try to make sense, because we are born into the middle of this giant continuum of history. A lot of times, to orient ourselves, we are trying to somehow privilege our own generation, right? Our generation is somehow more important than maybe a generation that came before. I think that's a natural way of thinking. We hopefully want to think that somehow we are living at a privileged point in history. And so for some people, what could be more privileged than ushering in the end of history?
Yeah.
In your own generation, right? The idea of imminent apocalypticism. Wow, our generation is going to be the one to see Christ come back, for instance, right?
Yeah.
That fuels a lot of apocalyptic thought in general.
The sense of an ending, right?
Sense of an ending.
I
exactly.
love that book.
Yeah. A great book. Okay,
Yeah.
so is that something that philosophers read too? I guess.
I know. Well,
Everybody reads it.
Yeah. I've dabbled in like literary theory. That's kind of from the interpretive, like, because I'm in my side of things is interpretation, so that fit very well. Yeah. That idea, and that's where you get the idea of the faithful few, right? And you've mentioned like those different ways that apocalypse gets picked up, whether it's the Protestant Reformation, Muslim incursion, heretics in the church. They're seeing the dissolution of the structure around them, and in order to make themselves, in some cases, feel special and to make sense of the world, one of the reoccurring things that kind of threads we've talked about is you have those faithful few, and so we get to be special. We are the elect, a common term. And then nothing makes you more special than you are like the few, the proud, the saviors, right? And then you have some kind of climax coming, the end of the world, everything's going to end, and then the only thing that's missing is like the Antichrist and maybe a really nice battlefield like Gog and Magog. It's really interesting to see how over and over again these things get taken in and then get put out in new ways that reflect people, like you take us all the way back to the beginning, people's concerns and people's worries about what they see falling around them. Do you see do you generally see more apocalyptic literature pop up when social structure is failing, or is that not really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And certainly the earlier examples are all in reaction to foreign rule, to foreign domination.
Yeah. And that's where you
the
get
book
the
of
Antichrist idea too. Like it's almost always the emperor or yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the Antichrist that's a whole separate thing that kind of the idea of Antichrist develops along the way out of all of these, some biblical texts and then other elements that are put up in there. So he kind of takes off on his own career of evil, in the from the early part of the first millennium. Um, but yeah, so the even without, it doesn't necessarily have to be antichrist as this opposing force. Again,
Mm,
that's something that developed a little later. But yeah, no, this um, this idea of that there is good and evil.
yeah.
That's something actually that came out of Zoroastrianism. That's
Mm,
that's not something that was as a structural element of Judaism. But Zoroastrianism, which was a religion that predates
right.
actually the other Abrahamic faiths, did have this idea of a radical dualism and the idea of good and evil as really constituted forces in the world. Not just that there are evil things or bad things that happen, but that there is this force of evil somehow in the world that's opposed to a force of good. So yeah, so you do have to have those two, and of course, uh, foreign domination in these early examples. That's a
Mm,
great example of a force that could be construed as being an evil force that's oppressing those of us who are chosen or the elect, or however you want to call it, the special ones.
yes, yes. And these narratives are often formed to keep that instead of submitting or assimilating, it reinforces the idea of like keeping. It's a way of creating a narrative that reinforces your identity, right? In the face of foreign oppression.
Yep.
We
Yeah.
see that
There's
with the Jews quite a bit, right? Like I mean, the Jewish identity has continued through Roman and several other types of foreign domination.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the social implications of apocalyptic thinking are to stay the course, to build cohesion, right? To say, okay, look at maybe like Revelation is a great example. The book of Revelation, right? There's all these bad things that happen to the non-elect, right? There's the tribulations, and the earth is destroyed, and the armies and bloodbath and everything else. But then at the end, it's very hopeful, right? The new Jerusalem descends from heaven. The kingdom of God is proclaimed. So the idea is, yes, that I'm sorry things are bad for you now. We know you're being oppressed. Bad stuff is happening, but stay the course,
Yeah.
right? Stay in your group, keep your faith strong, because your oppressors are eventually going to get their comeuppance and you will win out in the end. So, yes, there is this, I think, kind of hopeful aspect of apocalyptic literature as well, despite the fact that it's normally thought about as being destructive and bad. I think there is a glimmer of hope in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to be respectful of your time. So, just as we wrap up here, what is one thing that you would leave to our listeners about apocalypse? What is something for them to take home and think through that you have learned in your study?
Well, I guess I would say, I think, going back to this idea of looking at it in a kind of creative way.
Mm,
If you look at, for example, let's say I keep coming back to the book of Revelation, but I think that's a good example because it's the best known of all apocalyptic literature, and it's the one probably that our readers or our listeners would be the most familiar with, right? Everybody, even if you haven't read it, everybody's heard of 666 or the four horsemen or maybe the New Jerusalem, right? These ideas. And so I think that something like the book of Revelation has been responsible for the creation of all kinds of human thought, people really interested in it, trying to figure out over the course of 2,000 years, what does it mean? What is it saying to us today? So there's a lot of kind of thinking about it, intellectual pursuit about it. And some of it has been very, great thinking. The book of Revelation is the most written upon book of the entire Bible.
Mm.
There have been more commentaries written on that than anything else. So it definitely sparks an interest in us as human beings. And that also extends to the arts. I mean, you think about all the incredible art that's you opened this whole thing up with a discussion a little bit about art. Think of all of the paintings and frescoes and posters. I mean, tapestries, and sculptures maybe, and film and music and, comic books that have been created that drew some kind of inspiration from this one book that was written at the end of the first century. I think that's incredible. So I encourage anybody who's interested in this to say, wow, look at how influential some of this old literature has been and how it's caused human beings at all different times and in different places to create something new out of it. I guess that would be my thing to think about. I think that's cool. I don't, I'm like the most optimistic person in the world. I don't think the end of the world is happening. And I look at the kind of positive aspects of this. I'm not a doom and gloom person. I'm like, wow, look at how this has created things. And that's really my interest in it.
That's awesome. I can't think of a better way to end today. Dr. McAllister, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, PJ, thanks for having me. And I hope folks might follow up with some other of these things. I guess I can give a shameless plug if it's okay. There is, I did edit this Cambridge Companion to Apocalyptic Literature a few years ago. Has a great group of scholars. So I think if people want to find out more, this is a great resource to turn to.
Yeah, and I think I might have, I was talking to Dr. Tommaso, and what first got me interested was the musical one, which we'll make sure, I probably isn't on pre-order yet, but we'll provide some kind of link to hopefully find that too, because that's really fascinating as well.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'd appreciate that. Hopefully, I think publishing in general has gotten so much, everything's gotten bogged down coming out of COVID, right?
Oh, for sure.
So we are hopeful though that early to mid next year it should be out. They've got the whole manuscript. We're doing edits and stuff right now. So.
Oh, okay, awesome.
It's coming. Yeah, it's in the tank already. Our part is basically done. So
awesome. Well, thank you again. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, PJ. Take care.